Hello, and thank you all for joining us today for our live conversation and discussion entitled Black Women Can't Wait, a Black Women's Equal Pay Day discussion on race and the economy coming out of the pandemic and beyond. Today is Black Women's Equal Pay Day, and many of you are joining us from the national Twitter storm that just concluded with the goal of amplifying the message of the importance of closing the wage gap for Black women. Black Women's Equal Pay Day marks the day in the year where Black women must work to catch up to what white, non-Hispanic men made in just the previous year alone. So let me break that down for you with some numbers. This means that on today, August 3rd, already 8 months into this year, that Black women are waiting 18 months to earn what their white male counterparts earned in just 12, earning just 63 cents for every dollar paid out to a white non-Hispanic man. This translates into a loss of almost $1 million over the course of a 40-year career, and this loss is not just experienced by Black women, but for their families and the communities as well. And so as thousands of organizations and legislators and advocates stand together to observe and amplify the message of this day, we thought it was important to raise awareness around this crucial issue too, so that we can work to fix it. The pandemic has not only shined a light on the persistent racial and gendered economic inequalities that Black women face in the labor market, but has ultimately made it worse. Black women are overrepresented in many low-paying jobs that were dismissed as low-skilled before the pandemic, but are now seen as essential. However, these jobs are still being undervalued with low wages and very few benefits. And at this rate, if these pay trends continue, it'll take Black women more than 100 years to catch up. I'm Shannon Williams, the director of the Equal Pay Today campaign, a project of equal rights advocates, an organization dedicated to advancing and protecting the rights of women and girls most impacted by gender, racial, and economic inequities for over 4 decades. The Equal Pay Today campaign, launched on the 50th anniversary of the signing of the Federal Equal Pay Act, consists of both national and state-based organizations from all across the country, dedicated to challenging the legal, policy, and cultural barriers at the local, state, and national levels that keep women from being paid equally. And today I'm joined by some of the most remarkable people in this fight for equal pay, from the National Urban League, the nation's largest historic civil rights and urban advocacy organization, Urban League affiliates from across the country, and the Institute for Women's Policy Research, an organization dedicated on meeting the need for women-centered, policy-oriented research. For a discussion of recent research on the pay gap for Black women, the causes and consequences of racial and gender pay disparities, and policy strategies that can help to solve this issue. We have a fantastic panel for you today, who you'll meet a little later, and moderated by the phenomenal Joy Chaney, Executive Director of the Washington Bureau and Senior Vice President of Policy and Advocacy for the National Urban League. And we'll be collecting your questions throughout to answer at the end, so please feel free to put any questions you may have in the chat or use the Q&A feature, and we'll make sure to get those answered for you. But first, I'm going to turn the discussion over to the amazing Chandra Childers, Study Director for the Institute for Women's Policy Research, who's going to lay out the data and the research for us and paint a little picture of this landscape as to why Black women just simply can't wait. Chandra, please take it away. The floor is yours.
All right, thank you very much. I would like to thank everybody for joining me today. As I get the discussion started around Black Women's Equal Pay Day, I want to share with you some of the basic statistics from some of our latest research on the wage gap to kind of get the conversation rolling, get us started thinking about the gender wage gap that Black women face and what that means for their families, for their communities, before, as Shannon said, before I turn it over to our wonderful panel. So if I could get the next slide. So during the time that I have today, I want to dive into the gender wage gap for Black women, looking not only at that national pay gap, that 63 cents on the dollar, but I also want to look at how it's impacted by things like education. We often hear that education explains a lot of the pay gap. So I want to look at that. I want to look at what occupational segregation means for the gender wage gap for Black women, looking at both professional, managerial, and low wage occupations. And then I want to look at the data state by state so we can see what it looks like across different states. And then finally, I want to tie that up by looking at what Black Women's Equal Pay Day actually means in the lives of real Black women, their families, and for their communities. Next slide, please. Great, thank you. So let's start with the national gender wage gap that Black women and white men, between Black women and white men. So as Shannon mentioned, today marks the point in 2021 that Black women's earning equals what white men earned in 2020. So Black women have had to work 18 months to earn what white men earned in 12. And there has been very little progress in closing the gender wage gap for Black women. This graphic on your screen shows the annual earnings for Black women and white men nationally from 2009 through 2019. In 2009, Black women were paid just 61.9% of the earnings that white men were paid. Both white men and Black women have experienced a general increase in their incomes by 2019, but the wage gap has remained fairly stable. As you can see, in 2019, Black women were still only paid 63 cents for every dollar that was paid to white men. So over that entire decade, we've seen the gender wage gap really only closed by 1.1 percentage point, going from roughly 62% to 60, Black women being paid roughly 62% to 63% of what white men were paid. And the lack of movement in closing the gender wage gap is particularly concerning because over this decade, we have seen Black women improve their educational attainment at a much higher rate than have white men. So while white men are still more likely to have a bachelor's degree, Black women, the share of Black women with a bachelor's degree has increased by over 35% over the last decade. And we have not seen the wage gap respond as we would expect. Next slide. And it's not just that the wage gap has been really slow closing, looking backwards, but if we look at the change that we've seen in the gender wage gap for Black women and white men since 1985. And we look at how that, if the gap continues to close at that pace going forward, it will be over 100 years until 2133 before Black women reach pay equity with white men. And so what we are hoping is that we can change that trajectory, that we don't actually have to wait that long in order to close the gender wage gap. Next slide, please. Okay, so let's look a little bit closer at the impact that education has on the wage gap. So here we have data for Black women and white men aged 25 to 64 by level of education. So here we can see that everyone's earnings increase as you move, the level of education increases. Both Black women and white men with a bachelor's degree have earnings that are twice their earnings with less than a high school diploma, those who have not graduated high school. However, when you see Black women with a bachelor's degree, their earnings are only slightly higher than white men with a high school diploma. So even though Black women are increasing their education, that increase is still not closing that gap. And the lack of education for Black women is one of those most common explanations put forward. However, many Black women, what they're doing is they're responding to that common knowledge, if you will, and they're going out and they're getting more education. They're increasing their levels of educational attainment. And at the same time, they're going into significant debt, student loan debt, as they're trying to make this change. But while it does increase their earnings, and education is critical in order to earn a living wage, it's not closing the wage gap. Their earnings are still significantly lower than their white male counterparts. Next slide, please. So that was looking at education. We know that occupational segregation is one of the primary factors that explains the gender wage gap. Women and men tend to work in different occupations, and that's women and men generally. And looking at Black women and white men, that is particularly true. So what we have here are 5 broad occupational groups, and the numbers in parentheses are the median earnings for all workers within that occupational group. And the percentages at the end is the share of Black women and white men who work in those broad occupations. That first row shows that Black women are much less likely than white men to work in management, business, and financial operations occupations. So 16% of Black women and 21% of white men work in those occupations. These are jobs that have some of the highest median weekly earnings, $1,461 for the average worker. The next line, service occupations. This shows the distribution is even worse. Black women are more than twice as likely as white men to work in service occupations. And as you can see, these occupations pay less than half of what management, business, and financial operations occupations pay. So looking here, 21%, more than 1 in 5 Black women work in these occupations, while less than 10% of white men do. So looking at that, we can see how that generates a gender wage gap. And in addition, many of the service occupations, they have, a lot of them are part-time jobs, so it's hard to get full-time work when you're working in them. They have unpredictable schedules, so even if you're part-time, it's hard to supplement your income with another job because your scheduling is unpredictable. So there are a number of factors that impact workers in these jobs. And often overlooked, one other one that I want to highlight here is the natural resources, construction, and maintenance occupations. These are relatively well-paying occupations that do not require a college degree. So it does not require students to go into debt while earning a relatively good salary. Yet you can see that Black women and women overall are really underrepresented in these occupations. So I did want to highlight that because that's another opportunity for Black women in particular, but women generally, to move into occupations that pay relatively well. Next slide, please. Here we have those same occupational groups, but I want to look at what Black women and white men in particular are paid in those occupations. So again, looking at management, business, and financial operations, those are well-paying occupations. Black women are less likely to work in them than white men, but even when Black women do work in these occupations, they are paid less than their white male counterparts. So if you go down and look, you can see that in every one of these occupational groups, this is just comparing Black women and white men working in that same occupational group. You can see that there's still a wage gap. So even when Black women have the same level of education, even when Black women work in the same occupations, their earnings are less than their white male counterparts. And finally, I want to take a closer look at differences across states. Next slide. So what we have here are the 6 states with the largest wage gaps. So in Louisiana, Black women are paid just 47.9% of what white men are paid. In Washington, D.C., Black women are paid, where Black women actually have some of the highest earnings, but there's still a very large wage gap where Black women are paid just 52% of what white men are paid. And so Utah, New Jersey, Mississippi, South Carolina, these are all states that pay, again, less than 60%. Black women are paid less than 60% of the earnings of white men. But if you look at what that costs Black women over the course of a 40-year career, we're talking about over $1 million in most of these states. And in DC, it's almost $2 million. So Black women over the course of a career are losing a substantial amount of money. But it's not just the states with the largest wage gap. Next slide, please. Here we have the states with the smallest wage gap. And so of all the states, Hawaii has the smallest wage gap of any state. Black women in Hawaii are paid 82.7% of white men's earnings. So that gives them a wage gap of 17.3%. And no other state comes close. As you can see, the next state in line is Delaware, where Black women are paid just 68.5% of white men's earnings. And all the other states, the earnings ratio is lower. And so when we look, though, even at these states, at what it costs Black women, the state with the best outcome for Black women, Hawaii, still costs Black women almost $500,000 over the course of a career. And this is money that Black women lose in the labor market that they could be using to improve their lives, the lives of their families, and the lives of their communities. Next slide, please. So what does Black Women's Equal Pay Day really mean? What is it that we're really talking about when we're looking at the losses that Black women face? First of all, we are talking about higher poverty rates. Black women and their families face higher poverty rates than many other groups. As we saw, $1 million, $2 million in DC. That's money that Black women could use to provide for their family, to live in neighborhoods with good schools for their children, in order to pay for their children's college so their children don't have to take out student loans and go into debt. So that makes the pay gap, it shows the pay gap's intergenerational effects, not just affecting the women working today, but its impact on the next generation, on their children. It has an impact on their ability to build wealth. And this is a really key issue. It's the reduced ability to buy a home. It's less ability to build up savings and fewer resources for their retirement. So this has, again, implications that goes long-term over the course of their lives and into the next generation. But it also reduces their ability to weather economic downturns like the COVID-19 recession, like the Great Recession before that. Whenever we have economic downturns, it leaves Black women at the mercy of policymakers to decide whether or not they should provide resources to families that are struggling. But the money that Black women lose in the labor market, that's money they could use to help them weather these storms and make sure that they, their families, and again, their communities are able to thrive despite economic downturns that we face. Next slide. And so that is the data that I wanted to present and what I wanted to talk with you about. Thank you all for having me. And I now want to turn it over to Joy Chaney and our wonderful panel. Thank you, Joy.
Hi, Shannon. This is Joy Chaney. I don't know. Chandra, thank you so much, Dr. Childers. Did you, I don't know if you threw it to me. I couldn't hear you for some reason.
Yes.
Wonderful. I figured as much. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Joy Chaney, and I am so thrilled to be the moderator for this afternoon's panel. I am pleased to be Executive Director of the National Urban League's Washington Bureau, and in that role, I am Senior Vice President for Policy and Advocacy. I am also a former Executive Director of the Equal Pay Today campaign. So it is wonderful to be here wearing that hat, and also as a board member of Equal Rights Advocates. And I give a hat tip to my sister in this struggle, Shannon Williams, as well as Dr. Chandra Childers. I'm so glad to be on a panel today with three of the leaders from the National Urban League movement. We have, I'm going to go in order of alphabetical order because they're all outstanding. We have Chanel Brown, who is our advocacy director of our Urban League Young Professionals affiliate organization, or I always are auxiliary group, and I'll have her explain a little bit about what are the parameters of young professionals for those of us who no longer fit in that category. We also have Dr. Chanel Hawkins, who is the president and CEO of our outstanding Rochester, New York Urban League affiliate. Dr. Hawkins for 20 years served as a nonprofit leader. So we're so glad to have her. I was one of the newer presidents and CEOs on the newer end of the Urban League affiliates. And we have Judy Reese-Moore, who is the president and CEO of our Urban League of Louisiana. We are so glad. And let me just tell you, President Reese Moore has a long reputation and illustrious career working in state and local government. So hopefully she'll tell us a little bit about what happens at the state and local level to close these gaps, serving, I think most recently prior to coming to the Urban League as deputy mayor of New Orleans, Louisiana, which is huge, of course, and a big deal here at the Urban League, where we have our president and CEO, Mark Morial, who is a former mayor of New Orleans. And he will be joining us at some point during this panel. I'm so sorry that he was unable to be at the top as we expected, but he can't wait to be able to weigh in on Black Women's Equal Pay Day. Without that, I really hope, I think this was said before, but I'll go ahead and reiterate it. Really want to get questions from you all. One of the reasons we put together this panel and we did it the way that we did, we wanted to have one of our affiliate leaders, in this case, it's Dr. Hawkins, who represents a state where the wage gap for Black women is a little smaller. And then for President Reese Moore, where the wage gap is a little larger, because the truth is there's still a wage gap, no matter what state or what end you find yourself on that spectrum. And we want to talk about what's working, what can be working. We want this panel to be one of solutions, not one of just describing the water, right? We want to throw a life raft. And then also having Ms. Brown on is exciting because she gets to talk about what are some of the generational issues that we're dealing with when we talk about the wage gap. And just, many young women don't realize that it starts actually quite early in your career. It is certainly something that we experience as women get older, but it does begin early in the career, about a year or so into the workforce. So I'm just so thrilled to be on with you. And with that, I will open it up for our first question. I always laugh when we have to ask this question: why do we acknowledge Black Women's Equal Pay Day? Because I feel like because there's still a wage gap. Because Black Women's Equal Pay Day isn't on December 31st. It's on August 5th. Or August 3rd, rather. That's why. But there's so many people who don't believe it's a real thing. They don't believe the wage gap exists. They think it is can be explained away. I'd like to start with Dr. Hawkins, in part because you've been dealing with what happens to women in the community for a very long time. I'll acknowledge you're the first woman to lead the Rochester Urban League. And so I'd love to talk to you. Why, in your opinion, is it important to talk about all the things that Dr. Childress just talked about in IWPR's important report for Black Women's Equal Pay Day?
First of all, thank you for this opportunity to serve. I'm just thinking about this past election, how it's uplifted the power of Black women, i.e. Stacey Abrams. Like, we have demonstrated that we get the job done. And as usual, across the nation, women are expected to get the job done. But there isn't a lot of conversation about transparency about our pay. Our society has consistently demonstrated the devaluing of Black women's work with lower wages, in turn, less overall wealth, which limits Black women's ability to strengthen and build their economic stability. I mean, we have to have targeted solutions to address the persistent gender and race-based disparities that create disproportionate outcomes that weaken economic security for Black women. So we have to have solutions. And so one of the solutions at our Urban League is to ensure that not just, first of all, Black women, we talk about this situation, we have transparency, but we're working with organizations with our Interrupt Racism work. We're working with organizations on a 12-month cohort to really look at their practices and systems and how they perpetuate these issues. So they take a deeper look into their organization systemic issues, and they begin to do that work to dismantle those issues. So we're really proud of our Interrupt Racism work that we do, but that's one of the things that we can do to really bring some change about, but we have to talk about it. If we don't talk about it, it won't change. And I certainly can't wait. My daughter can't wait. My future granddaughter cannot wait. So we have to do this work absolutely right now.
You would think I would know to unmute myself. Thanks so much, Dr. Hawkins. Judy, let me bring you in a little bit, because in Louisiana, where the gap is large, right? Why is it so important to talk about it there? And frankly, do Black women have a sense of the wage gap there? Uh-oh. Judy, you're on mute.
All right.
It happens to the best of us.
Yes. The world of virtual meetings. Thank you so much, Joy, for the opportunity to participate in this important conversation. And like my sister Sean in Rochester just mentioned, we've got a real issue here. This equity pay gap for Black women is a problem that must be addressed. I think about it this way. It's been said that as the health and wealth of a Black woman goes, so does our community. So as we continue to better educate ourselves about this issue, we put ourselves in the best position possible to bring about the change that will actually do the work, which is to close that gap. In Louisiana, as we just heard a few minutes ago, Black women earn 48 cents for every dollar paid to white men. That is the worst earnings ratio of any state in the country and the District of Columbia. But here's what's also really, really telling. When you look at 2010, Black women earned 47 cents for every dollar paid to white men. So in 11 years, Black women increased their earnings by a single penny for every dollar paid to white men. This is just simply unacceptable. It's unacceptable, it's unsustainable, and at this rate, the next 4 generations of Black women in Louisiana will not see the gap close in their lifetimes unless we change this. So we have to continue to collect these important data points. We have to write these important reports. We have to have conversations like this one, and we have to make policy and political changes that will intentionally do the work that will close the gap with a particular focus on Black women. As Sean just said, we cannot solve problems that we aren't willing to acknowledge, talk about, and act on. But I also want to say, Joy, that this is an economic problem. Sounds simple to say, but it's important to say, because when we think about a particular segment of the population that is not allowed to reach its full economic potential, then we know the entire economy suffers. So it is important to articulate why a day like today is important. And the real question is, should there be more days like this in a given year? There's a lot of work that the Urban League of Louisiana is doing, and I know a little bit later in the conversation, we'll have an opportunity to talk about what we're doing specifically in our states to address this issue. But it's an issue that has to change.
Absolutely. And one of the things I think is so important to bring up a breakdown of state by state breakdown that IWPR just did, the state by state breakdowns and all, various breakdowns on demographic that National Women's Law Center does and IWPR does some as well as other organizations, is because it also tells a story. Washington, D.C. is also a place where there's a very large wage gap for Black women and Latino women, but there's not a huge wage gap for women overall. And that's because white women, there's a smaller gap for them. And so if you just looked at the number for women, you would think Washington, D.C. is doing really well. You would think that California, actually, where Chanel is doing really well. And in fact, that is not the case for women of color. Chanel, can you talk about exactly what's happening to women of color in terms of the wage gap? We think of California as a wealthy part of the country. We imagine Silicon Valley and what's happening to women of color in California, and why is it important to talk about Black Women's Equal Pay Day out there?
Well, thank you, Joy, and thank you, National Urban League family, for having me here. I'm the National Advocacy Chair for the National Urban League Young Professionals. Joy asked, what's the criteria? Well, we're open to all, but we do ask for folks who are 21 to 40 to join our ranks, and I'll drop my contact information in the chat. Joy said it right. From the outset, it looks like California is doing well. And I am a native here, and I will tell you that we are not. There is a wage cap, there is a housing insecurity crisis, and there's a homelessness crisis that is exacerbated by this wage gap. And it's gripped my family personally. And we were fortunate to be able to come out of that crisis. But what about the women who don't have this sense of privilege like we do? We have to acknowledge our privilege. You know, a lot of women who don't have a college education, that may be non-English speakers, who may be disabled. How are we advocating for those women? So I want to make sure that we place the interests and the needs of our most marginalized women in this conversation. The young professionals were mobilized across this country around Black Women's Equal Pay Day, but it's true, we need to mobilize year-round 365 around this issue, and it starts with us and it ends with us. I know Black women, we get tired, we're saving the day, we saved this country in the last election cycle, but we have more work to do, but it's going to take all of us, women, men, allies, policymakers, as well as employers, to keep our foot on the gas and make sure that we continue to level up this issue, keep this at the top of our policy agendas, and make sure that these policymakers know that this is an actual crisis and state of emergency.
That's great. So one other question, just sort of on the facts and the level setting. And I think we're being joined by our president and CEO, Mark Morial. We'll weave him in here after this first question. But we talk so much about income, and that's really important. And Black Women's Equal Pay Day is in part measuring how much people are getting paid. But can anyone want to jump in and tell me what's the difference between income and wealth, and what is the importance of income to wealth, but how the wage gap impacts that wealth end of things in addition to income?
Well, I'll start by saying, when you think about income versus wealth, wealth is what we look to be able to share, to be able to pass on to the next generation. And so that phrase wealth and the generational wealth are so important to us. Historically, though, we have not had the opportunities that whites have had in order to build that wealth and then to share that wealth, pass it on to the next generation. We know that owning a home is one of the most basic ways in this country to be able to share wealth and to pass that wealth on to the next generation. And we know historically, because of policies of the past and policies still today, there's been institutional racism and systems in place that have not allowed Black people to be able to purchase homes and to be able to purchase property. So that is an example of what happens when you don't have wealth and you're not able to pass that wealth on. Income is so important, and it is critical because the right amount of income over the lifetime of a person's career allows them to build that critical savings that they, again, can also share and leave behind for the next generation. And so both are so important. We need both of them in order to be able to make things better for the next generation and give the next generation a starting point. If that can continue and can get passed down from generation to generation, then you will see those gaps starting to close. And that's some of the work that we're looking at here in Louisiana. How do we create the environment so that that can happen? It must happen. Otherwise, we're just living our lives from start to finish, but we're not able to pass anything on to the next generation, and they're starting from scratch. And it shouldn't be that way. It's not that way for everyone.
And before we go on, I'm going to let Mark jump in, but I want to remind everyone of what some of the data says. So if the wage gap is at 63 cents on the dollar of white non-Hispanic men, right? Comparing Black women to white non-Hispanic men. But and that results in $1 million, nearly $1 million lost over the 40-year career of the average Black woman. Imagine what it is in Louisiana, where the rate is around 40 or so cents, or California, where Chanel is, where it's around 50 or so. And it's perhaps smaller where Dr. Hawkins is in New York, but I don't think there's any place where we're doing better than 70 or so percent. So over the course of a lifetime, those are huge, huge shortfalls that we are not able to put into our families. And with that, President and CEO of the National Urban League, Mark Morial, I'm going to turn it over to you to bring us some greetings. Mark, you're on mute.
Hey, there we go. All right. Hey, Joy Cheney, thank you so much. Appreciate your leadership and that of the National Urban League Washington Bureau team for organizing this activation today. And let me express my appreciation and profound respect for all of the women, the Black women who serve in leadership roles within the Urban League movement at the board level, across the executive team, the staff in both New York and Washington, and obviously all of the powerful sisters who lead Urban League affiliates from coast to coast. Those of you who have joined today, I just appreciate, and I'm always in awe of your tremendous leadership and your hard work. This discussion, of course, is a discussion on race and the economy. This discussion relates to Black women's equal pay. And you know, and we know, the historic undervaluing, underpayment, and underrepresentation of Black women in every facet and every form. And I salute the very special Black women and young women in my own life, my wonderful mother, who's always been a friend and a role model, my wife, who is a phenomenal woman in her own right, my two daughters who teach me every day, who are such an important part of my life and my happiness, and I learn from them every day. The global pandemic has affected Black women as mothers, as teachers, as personal care aides, nursing assistants, retail salespersons, doctors, lawyers, social workers, and have only been making 63 cents for every dollar white men are paid. We call it out because it is unacceptable. We call it out because over a 40-year career, this wage gap will equate to $1 million. $1 million that could go towards supporting themselves and their families. 1 million that can be used to save and invest for the future. 1 million that could be spent on goods and services, or 1 million that could be passed on to your progeny. And these numbers demonstrate that the wage gap between white men and Black women, they're a direct consequence of the institutional systems of sexism and white supremacy that date back to the United States past of enslaving Black people. We have to confront it. We don't fix it. We don't remediate it by ignoring it. We confront it. And that's why at the National Urban League, we support comprehensive policies that ensure that Black women and their jobs are properly, equitably, and adequately valued. That's why we support opportunities for entrepreneurship. And in our entrepreneurship centers across the nation, some 60% of the entrepreneurs we work with are Black women. When we support the economic viability, the prosperity of Black women, we support Black families, we support Black children. We know the important role that Black women play in the quality of life, not only for themselves, but for their families and extended families and in the community. We're going to acknowledge this issue. We're going to proactively include it in our conversations regarding disparities faced in the Black community. We've got to close the gender wage gap and the secure equal pay for Black women. These are 21st century issues. These issues are intertwixt and intertwined and intermingled with a broader discussion about race and class and institutional racism in American life. The George Floyd moment, the tragic murder of that brother on the streets of Minneapolis continues to have a profound impact, as it should, as it should. And we are woke and will remain woke to the issue of the wage gap and the income gap as it relates to Black women. So I'm Mark Morial. Thank you for having me. Appreciate the tremendous leadership, Joy, and to all of the very phenomenal Black women, all of the very phenomenal leaders who joined us today. Let's forge ahead. Let's keep on keeping on. Be blessed.
Thanks so much, Mark.
All right.
So, one of the things that Mark has really empowered me to do, and really has already done himself, is really remind the world that when you're talking about what impacts Black women, that is what impacts African Americans as well, right? So women's rights and racial justice issues as well. And we certainly believe that at the National Urban League. And so we want to thank our partners, IWPR and Equal Pay Today and Equal Rights Advocates, for partnering with us. So Dr. Hawkins, I'm going to throw it back to you before, and then I'm going to go to Chanel. So let's talk a little bit about solutions. Mark began talking about it. What is the Urban League seeing in terms of, can you tell me about what our programs, our housing programs, and our entrepreneurship programs? What are we seeing happening with Black women there? Rental and home ownership. I'd love to know if you know, and if not, we can talk about other issues as well.
Yeah, I would love to provide you some solutions, because we are all about solutions. But yes, I want to say that we have to address the problem, because if we don't, it's going to take us 100 years to close the wealth gap. And so we have to do something. And then when you think about the stress and trauma of COVID-19, this is where we see the effects of weathering because of the constant stress, right? And the repeated exposure to socioeconomic adversity, marginalization, racism, as Mark already talked about, continuous discrimination, and then rental arrears, right? You just add that stress to that. I mean, you have to have solutions that put Black women on strong financial and healthy ground. And that's what we're doing at the Urban League. Mark talked about entrepreneurship. We have an entrepreneurship assistance center where we're providing not only financial support, we're providing them debt-free capital so that they can build their business, so that they can move their business forward and go beyond any crisis. Additionally, we are working with women, Black women, but we're helping people of color with getting into home ownership. Judy Reese-Moore, she talked about wealth building. And so we have a program, we're the first in New York State, it's called L2P. This is a lease to purchase program where we help people to get into a home. You rent. So we're at a base of about 30% of your income or less. You rent for the first 15 years. In year 15, you can purchase the home for what we believe is going to be just the principal interest. So that's $25,000 to $30,000. This is how you build equity within 5 years. So now they get a $200,000 home for the price that they were paying for rent. Okay, when we're talking about having more income available to them. Now they have more income available to them. Then in 5, they can purchase that home and they have equity. They purchased that home for $25,000 to $30,000. Now they have something to share, as Judy spoke of, to pass along to their families. Those are the solutions that we need. Innovative ideas that are going to change the game and position Black families on strong financial and healthy ground. And that's what we want to see. So that's one of the things that we're doing at the Urban League of Rochester. In addition to our supports, we have a business accelerator program for entrepreneurs, for Black women, for also for all people of color, but we have been focusing on Black women just to make sure that they are well positioned to weather any storm.
And that's right. And I'll jump in just as the policy lead for the National Urban League. We're fighting for the Paycheck Fairness Act. We are fighting for an increase in the minimum wage to $15 an hour. And since I used to be Chief of Staff for Kirsten Gillibrand, I gotta say, we're also fighting for paid leave because that's her issue in the United States Senate. But what Dr. Hawkins is also talking about is that we have to find solutions that are not dependent on somebody's filibuster, right? And so solutions that aren't just coming from Congress. There's solutions that are also coming at the state and local level that are important as well. So it's that combination, the public policy at the national level, the Paycheck Fairness Act, the equal, all those things, but also real practical solutions on the ground. And Chanel, I'd like to bring you in a little bit. What are some of the things that we need to be doing in order to reach young women who don't always see the wage gap as impacting them, right? Maybe because they have not had children, or because, it looks like in the beginning where everyone gets paid the same. And since I'm one of the equal pay experts on here, I'll remind you, it doesn't. The wage gap begins about a year or so after a man and woman begin working. So it doesn't start there, but then it grows. And it grows over the course, and it grows exponentially once that woman, of course, has children and gets older. How can we reach young women to let them know that this is important, this impacts them?
Well, thank you, Joy, and thank you for having me on this panel to be the resident ambassador. I just said that we serve young professionals 21 to 40 years old. That is your money-making wealth generation years, 20s, 30s, and 40s. And so we have a lot of room for opportunity with our demographic, starting with salary negotiations. I know that Joy just did an amazing career success panel. Virtually, I tuned in. We need to understand the mechanics. It doesn't start on the day you want the raise. Sometimes you have to start 6 to 12 months in advance. It's a fine dance. And I have negotiated my salary, but guess what? I learned that the loudest talking is when you're not even in the room. When you're not in the room and you have these decision makers speaking on your behalf. So I actually got a raise and I didn't even ask for it because I had a close relationship with that decision maker who vouched for me to my company CEO. So we need more
You have to have
stories.
a sponsor.
We need more sponsors.
Yes.
We need more success stories, and we need the how-to. We have the credentials. We have the educational background. Black women are outpacing our counterparts when it comes to education, but it's not allowing us to lock into that American dream. Actually, when we graduate, we realize that the American dream is unrealized because we're saddled with debt and we still cannot penetrate these high competitive salary industries, right? So this is a macro issue. I don't think it stays with the salary negotiation. That's a big part of it, but it's a larger issue. We have to even think about discriminatory practices on the job, right? How are we able to ensure that Black women are able to advance to get those competitive salaries? We're doing pretty good getting these women into entry-level positions, but how do we get them to be in the C-suite? That's a more complicated issue. So I think we as young professionals, we have a lot of opportunity to assist, our peers in that aspect. And National Urban League, we sit at the nexus of economic empowerment and civil rights. We understand the nuances of the business community as well as the civil rights community. And before I close, I did want to salute our late great executive director, Whitney Young. We celebrated his 100th birthday on social media, and he was a champion for integrating and partnering with corporate America. So yes, we do have to pass legislation at the national level, the state level, and the local level for those protections, but we often have to be willing to partner directly with these employers and ensure that they can actually have a stake and lead from the corporate level.
That's absolutely right. Okay, so we're going to get to some of the questions. One of the questions we had in the chat was about negotiating. And I'm going to assume all of you ladies here negotiated your salaries when you joined the Urban League. But, or whatever organization that you're at. I know that Chanel does not work at the Urban League, but she is one of our wonderful volunteers. How do we overcome, Judy, and maybe you have some advice for this, how do we overcome fear of negotiation as Black women and Latinas?
It's such an important point. I mean, it is such a critical point. I'm so glad that we're talking about it. I can remember when I was deputy mayor for the city of New Orleans, and some of my younger colleagues came into my office when it was time for us to finalize their positions in the mayor's office and to talk about salary. Just about to a person, they were afraid, they were nervous, and they didn't ask for what they were worth. I told them to leave the office, to go back and think about what it is that they should be saying to me. I told them all the things that they said that were incorrect and what they should never say again, and then come back into my office and start the conversation again. And obviously, it turned out better the second time for them, but I wanted to use that opportunity to help them in a way that I wish I had been helped when I was a little bit younger in my career. You have to understand your value and your worth. You have to know what you're bringing to the table, particularly Black women. We bring education, we bring lived experience, we bring meeting expectations in our personal lives, in our civic lives. We bring so much to the table. We have to understand that there is a value for all of that. And we're bringing all of that to the table. And so really, really finding someone who is good at it. Don't be afraid to talk to other people, talk to other professional women. If you have a mentor, talk to your mentor. If you don't have one, find one, someone who will invest in you and who cares about your success. And then role play if you need to. Talk to yourself in the mirror. Do whatever you need to do in order to practice feeling comfortable and accepting your value and your worth, because this is what we know. We know that this country cannot be what it is cracked up to be, what it calls itself, what it doesn't always live up to as a promise, but it cannot be successful and it cannot reach its full potential without Black women. That is a fact. So know who you are, know what you bring to the table, talk to someone before you go in to negotiate. And then I'll say this, don't be afraid to walk away if the opportunity does not meet your value. Don't be afraid to walk away. There is another opportunity out there that will. And when you start doing that, you as a Black woman can help to close that gap. Sometimes the gap is there, not just because of the systems that are in place working against us, but they're in place because we accept less than what we deserve. And we don't always have the opportunity to make another choice, but when we can, we definitely should.
Absolutely. Dr. Hawkins, just really quickly, I mean, what do you tell folks who don't even know how to begin the process of, maybe they want to ask for a raise, but they're actually not sure where to even begin. Any tips if someone came to you and said, I want to know what the job range is, and they don't post it? Of course, at Equal Pay Today and ERA and National Urban League, we love it when you post a salary range. But if your employer doesn't post one, are there any tips you would give?
Absolutely.
I know we didn't prepare for this one, but
yes, but this is something that I strongly believe in. And so first of all, just what we're doing right now is so important, because we don't have these conversations with our young Black women about money. We don't talk about negotiating salary. We don't even, we get a job offer and they tell us that it's going to pay $18 an hour, and we'll say, thank you, that's great. But no, we have to know what the position is going to entail. We have to do our homework. If you're going to work at a nonprofit, you want to look at 990s and see what the organization is bringing in. What are some of the salary ranges? If it's a for-profit, you can do some searches to see what that salary range is, but you have to come in and do your homework and know your value. I mean, Judy, you could not have said that better, because that is so important. And you cannot have a fear of walking away, because remember, this is the American way to devalue Black women. And so you have to state your value. You have to let them know what you bring to the table, all that you can bring. And if they're not willing to pay you, you have to trust that there's something better and be okay with walking away. But again, I would say, one, we as women have to tell other women, Don't just take what they offer you. Here's what you do. I just gave my niece the other day a script on what to say when they offer her the job and how to negotiate that salary. She said, I didn't know you could do that. You absolutely can do that and get more money. And then she's like, oh, I'm so mad at myself. I undercut myself because she wanted the job. And I get that. Sometimes there are opportunities where you find like, I want this job. I want to show what I can do. And then I can renegotiate my salary. There are times when you can do that. But no, do your homework. Understand what the position has paid and do that work. And as Judy said, practice it. When you talk about money, have the serious poker face. Yes, I said I want this salary. And then move on. And you don't leave room for them to not take you seriously, but do your homework. That's my advice to women.
That's right. And let's be clear, we are not saying it's all up to you. White men negotiate probably on average that others negotiate. Matter of fact, there was a great Washington Post study that showed this, but the truth is they have better results. So we know that that's part of it. But it is also true that we do have to negotiate. And when you come in there with numbers and facts, and that serious, I'm about business face, you give less room to give an alternative answer other than yes. You say, and when you come in there, when you're even looking to get a raise, because part of this isn't just about entry salary, it's also about raises. When you come in there and you have been chronicling what you bring to the table throughout the year, and you're not coming in there trying to remember offhand, but you've written down, here are the things that I brought in, the money I brought in, the relationships that I have forged, the product that I have produced, the projects that I have accomplished. When you come in there with hard facts, that makes it very difficult for anyone to allow their racism, their bigotry, their implicit bias. It's not always that they're doing it intentionally. I was talking to an expert once who said that men are often judged based on their potential, whereas the women in the workplace are judged on what they've done. And so potential is always better, guys, always, right? And so, you really do have to come in there and you have to give people the data. And this is what I've done. And this is how, this is what I brought to the table. And this is what I expect. And any fear that you might have that you're going to get fired or you're not, it never happens. Has anyone heard of someone who got fired because they asked for a raise? It just doesn't happen. Most often or not, you may not get the answer you want, but at least the person knows that you demand more for yourself and you know your value. Well, we are coming to the end of our time. I want to thank our fantastic panelists, Judy Reese-Moore from Louisiana, Chanel Brown from California, and our YPs, our young professionals, and Dr. Sean Hawkins from Rochester. Thank you to Shannon Williams, who is the Executive Director of Equal Pay Today and a Senior Counsel of Equal Rights Advocates, and of course, to Dr. Chandra Childers at the Institute for Women's Policy Research. Thank you so much. They put in the chat the link to the report. Shannon, anything else before we sign off?
No, this was a fantastic discussion. We want to thank everybody for joining us today. We do want to highlight that the conversation is still happening today for Black Women's Equal Pay Day on social media. So please join in using the hashtags Black Women Equal Pay and hashtag Black Women Can't Wait.
We cannot wait. Thank you so much, everyone, and have a great rest of your afternoon. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much, Joy and family. Hope to see you soon.
See you soon.
Hey, everyone.
Bye.